Denver Broncos head coach Sean Payton is getting close to naming his starting quarterback, but is he close enough as the Green Bay Packers come to town for joint practice and a preseason game on Sunday? We're breaking it all down on today's episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Broncos, where we're breaking down some key players coming back to practice after getting hurt the last few days, as well as what we want to see from the Broncos and their joint practice and preseason matchup with the Green Bay Packers. But the big story remains, what's the deal at quarterback? When is Sean Payton finally going to name his starter? Well, not yet is the answer to that question. And we'll tell you more about what he said in an awesome interview with Kay Adams over there at the Up and Adams show. Again, welcome in Broncos Country. My name is Sayre Bedinger, co-host here of Locked on Broncos, as well as the site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. And today's episode of Locked on Broncos is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. And FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So visit FanDuel.com to get started and subscribe or follow for free to this show on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast so that you don't miss a single episode as soon as it's available. Broncos Country, the big story in Denver right now continues to be the fact that the team has not named a starting quarterback, although I feel like everybody can kind of see the writing on the wall, right? And the best evidence of that is when you get somebody with an outside perspective who really comes in and says, look, like we kind of see what's going on here. We know what you're doing. Why not just name your starting? Why not just name Bo Nix your starting quarterback? We know that all roads are leading there for the Denver Broncos and head coach Sean Payton, but Sean's not ready to do that just yet. And I thought we got a really insightful interview once again from Kay Adams. Sean always gives Kay Adams a good interview. And I think that he's just a little more loose when he's talking with her just about certain things. And she, quite frankly, asks very direct questions and gets direct answers. And I love it. So go listen to that interview if you haven't already. But when she asked Sean, like, why don't you just name Bo Nix your starting quarterback? Like, it doesn't make sense to keep spinning everybody's wheels, right? And he said, well, it's important to the team that they see Bo really going out there to earn the job. And he kind of gave the analogy of like, they're not just naming starters at every other position. Like he gave the cornerback position as for example. He said, we're not just going to name, either Riley or Damari off the bat. We're going to let those guys battle it out. And it's important that the quarterback position, to him at least, is not on a different competitive scale than that, right? And so he talked about how they're taking a different philosophical approach compared to the Bears, because Kay Adams brought that up when she was talking to him. She's like, the Bears just kind of named Caleb Williams their starter right out of the gates. They didn't even bring a veteran in for any competition, nothing like that. And Sean said it's just a different philosophical approach. And he said that they're getting close. And he said if you come back in the next week or two, he might have a different answer. But we know that Sean's not just saying this stuff to the media and then going and doing a different thing completely in practice, right? Because Thursday's practice, it was Jarrett Stidham running with the first team offense, and it was their first padded practice of the week. Of course, the Broncos, they're on a bit of a shorter week this week as they get into sort of the game flow at practices. But Jarrett Stidham was running with the first team offense, and they were back in pads after just kind of shells yesterday. So it's one of those things that's like I don't know if it's hey, we're just kind of waiting for the sake of waiting at this point, or we want to wait as long as we can to see what we've got in Jarrett Stidham, or if he can really win this competition. But we do know this, that when the Broncos take the field against the Green Bay Packers on Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening, it's going to be Bo Nix getting the start there. So you figure if they're going on again, off again in terms of these days, stacking up at practice, Bo Nix was running with the ones on Wednesday when they weren't wearing pads. Jarrett Stidham running with the ones on Thursday when they were wearing pads. So when the Packers come to town for joint practice here Friday, it is going to probably be Bo Nix running with the first team again. And so you kind of get the impression that the pendulum is swinging. As we know, Sean Payton and his staff, they script all these things out, weeks before they happen, or at least the week of. They kind of say, all right, here's how every single day this week is going to go. These guys know exactly what's going on here. They know exactly it's not a random occurrence that Bo Nix would be back with the ones against the Green Bay Packers at joint practice, right? It's very much calculated, very methodical. And it does seem to be that all roads are leading towards Bo being named the starter after this Green Bay game. And if you remember back a couple weeks ago, I kind of threw that out there as the timeline. Not that I'm, it's not rocket science by any means. You kind of just look at the general history of when quarterbacks get named the starter. It's usually after the second to last preseason game, because the last preseason game, you kind of want to have most of your roster defined. You want to have most of your depth chart defined. And that last preseason game is an opportunity maybe to sort out your practice squad spots and things like that, as well as maybe some bottom end of the roster type deals. So for me, it's always been Bo Nix coming out of this Green Bay week and being the starter in this Green Bay game and at joint practices is going to give this coaching staff their clearest look at Bo Nix as all right, we're preparing basically for game style stuff. We're going up against defenses that it's not our own defense anymore. We're going up against a new defense, a new scheme, things like that. They're going to be throwing different things at you. And I could tell you, based on what I've seen and heard out of Green Bay Packers camp, they are going to be sending a lot at these quarterbacks when it comes to Jeff Hafley, the defensive coordinator there in Green Bay, former Boston College head coach, now as the defensive coordinator in his first year at Green Bay, has been ultra aggressive this offseason, and they've got tons of talent on that side of the ball. So I expect Bo Nix going to have a lot thrown at him here as we get into these joint practices, and that's going to frankly bring out the best in him and Jarrett Stidham in this competition. If it's real, if it's legit, like if this is a legit competition and Jarrett Stidham goes out there and is slinging it against the Packers defense and Bo Nix is throwing interceptions or struggling, things like that, maybe the conversation is a little bit different. Maybe this is why Sean Payton is waiting, because you get a joint practice against the Packers, let's say, and all the coverage of it is, well, Bo Nix really struggled against the Green Bay Packers in joint practice. He was throwing, one interception after another, didn't keep his composure, whatever the case may be. I think that would be really interesting in terms of the narrative if Sean Payton had already named his starting quarterback. So again, Broncos country, there's nothing to worry about in terms of the timeline. It's important to kind of consider all of the different angles of this, right? It's important to consider Sean Payton is a very old school guy, comes from the Bill Parcells coaching tree. There's really no rush to name the starter, other than the fact that you might be kind of wondering, if you're in Broncos country right now, you might be wondering, is it now a hindrance to Bo Nix to not be giving him starter reps if he's going to be your starter at the beginning of this season? You know that he's going to be the starter. Is it a hindrance in practice not to be giving him those first team reps? Does that come back to haunt you in any way? I don't know that that's the case. I think it would be maybe something that you could point back to and blame potentially if things don't go well at the beginning of the season for Bo Nix. You could say, well, they should have given him more starter reps during training camp and things like that. I get that. I understand that. But it's probably just a matter of days at this point. Honestly, Broncos country, we're not far off. You could tell in the interview that Sean did with Kay Adams. I mean, you could tell that he's kind of just been bubbling beneath the surface, so to speak, where he's wanting to make this announcement. I think he's ready to make the announcement, but it's just not the right time yet based on what they're trying to do with Stidham and things like that. So whatever the reasoning, Broncos country, we still don't know who's going to be the starter. And as of Thursday, I mean, Jarrett Stidham was still getting reps with the first team offense. So what do you make of that? Do you make anything of it whatsoever? All I know is the Green Bay Packers are coming to town with a ton of talent, a very different team, even though it's similar in terms of the roster, a very, very different team than the team that we saw come to Denver last October. And now the Packers, they have a legit franchise quarterback who is paid appropriately, according to that label. And they have a young roster with tons of talent, a new defensive scheme, some of the best coaches in the NFL. Broncos country, the Packers are coming to town. What are we watching out for in this joint practice and preseason game against Green Bay? Well, we're going to talk about maybe some intriguing matchups to look out for up next on today's Locked On Broncos. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or therapy day. When your schedule is packed with kids' activities, big work projects, and more, it's easy to let your priorities slip. Even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to always make time for it, right? But when we feel like we have no time for ourselves, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Therapy is helpful for learning positive coping skills, how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. And it isn't just for those who have experienced major trauma. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. The Denver Broncos are going to get a big test from the Green Bay Packers as they come to town for joint practice and a preseason matchup. Maybe most notable is going to be those Green Bay Packers stellar wide receivers up against a Broncos defensive backfield that is young, relatively inexperienced, and certainly has a lot to prove before the start of the season. But before we get into those matchups and things that we're going to be looking out for at joint practice, I want to say thank you to every single one of you that makes Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And for your second listen today, Broncos Country, go ahead and check out Locked On Fantasy Football. Get all those tips that you need in order to dominate your league this season. And the Broncos, they are welcoming the Green Bay Packers for joint practices. I personally love the fact that they're bringing in Green Bay for joint practice, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. Of course, competitively is number one. Number two, I think it's really convenient for the Broncos to get an up-close look at a roster like Green Bay's, because Green Bay is one of those teams right now that they've drafted so exceptionally well over the last handful of years, and they've loaded up their roster in such a way that, let's say the Broncos have one or two, maybe three spots at the back of their 53-man roster that they're like, we like the guys that we have, but we feel like we could get this guy to the practice squad. We really loved what we saw from this Packers player in joint practice and getting an up-close look at him. Our coach has got, a lot of film on him, and our scouts liked him anyway. I think there's a lot of value to joint practices in that way. And it's also just good from a Brian Gutekunst, the GM of the Packers, Matt LaFleur, those guys do team building extremely well. It could be beneficial for Sean Payton and his staff. I mean, I know that Sean is a veteran of this league, and certainly general manager George Payton is a veteran of this league. It's just a good idea, in my opinion, for those two to kind of, bring their minds together and say, hey, let's talk through some of this stuff, even if it is just chumming it up over dinner or something like that. I really like that the Broncos are bringing the Packers in specifically. We know the Broncos back when they hired Nathaniel Hackett, they wanted to bring in Adam Stenavich and a number of others off of that Green Bay staff. And so there are connections to this Packers organization already for the Broncos, and I'm sure they go way deeper than just that. But I like the idea of bringing in the Packers for this joint practice. It's just a good meeting of the minds. And certainly on the field, the Packers present an intriguing challenge. When the Broncos are on offense at joint practice, what do we want to see from joint practice? I think the number one thing that I'll be watching for in terms of, I watch Cody update his practice notes on his, the Apple Notes document every day. I'm watching Twitter during practice every day to see what people are posting, video clips, and what people are saying that are in attendance at practice there. I think the number one thing that I'm going to be looking out for is, how does that Denver Broncos pass protection hold up against a Green Bay Packers defensive front that is very, very good. And I mean, you could go top to bottom here with just every position group that the Packers have off the edge. Rashawn Gary, Preston Smith, those two guys are as good as it gets off the edge in terms of just bringing the heat consistently, putting and applying pressure on your offensive tackles with their combination of traits, speed, power, veteran savvy, a diversity of pass rush moves. Those guys have all of those things. And then the Packers interior defensive line, they probably have the most underrated interior defensive lineman in the NFL in Kenny Clark. Are we going to get to see some practice clips of Quinn Meinerz going up against Kenny Clark? That is going to be fun to potentially watch. But not only that, they've got guys like TJ Slayton, former first-round pick Devontae Wyatt. There's so many talented players. Of course, former first-round pick Lucas Van Ness, my guy out of Iowa. Go Hawkeyes. I can't wait to see how the Broncos offensive line responds to these guys coming in and bringing the heat on every single play. Not to mention, Packers have been pretty blitz happy as far as what we've heard out of Packers camp in their first preseason game with a variety of really talented defensive backs that they have brought in over the last, year or so. Notably, rookie Javon Bullard from Georgia. He is a absolute menace out there when the Packers ask him to come up to the line of scrimmage. So I think how the offensive line holds up against this defensive front is going to be fascinating to see, because are we going to get a lot of false steps from Mike McGlinchey and Garrett Bowles? Are those guys going to hold their own and protect the quarterback? Are they going to protect Bo Nix out there? How many clean looks is Bo actually going to get? And the interior pressure is worth noting as well, because I think with the guys that I mentioned that Green Bay brings to the table, how do Ben Powers and Quinn Meinerz, two very highly priced offensive guards, how do those guys communicate with Luke Wattenberg or Alex Forsythe at the center position to really help pick up whatever Green Bay is going to throw at them? We should see plenty of team situations between these two when it comes to this joint practice, because these teams want to evaluate that type of stuff. They don't necessarily want to play the starters in a preseason game. At least the Packers, we know that they're not playing all their starters by any means. So they want to get a good look at these guys in joint practice. And I think that the Broncos present an interesting matchup for them as well, from just in terms of a high-priced offensive line going up against a lot of investment on the defensive front as well. The Packers have paid a lot of money to Rashawn Gary and Kenny Clark and guys like that. So going to be fun to watch those updates. Hopefully no fisticuffs, because it's going to be competitive out there for sure. Also offensively for the Broncos, are the receivers winning matchups? The Broncos wide receiver room is very big. It's I don't want to say it's clunky, but it's not a finesse type of wide receiver room, right? Sean Payton has prioritized size at the position. So these guys it's not that they can't run routes, but can they create separation against an athletic defensive backfield that Green Bay has? Going to be fun to see those matchups unfold and whether or not the Broncos can win those matchups. And how does Bo Nix look against that top Packers defense, right? Because if things kind of carry over from what we saw in week 1 of the preseason, are we going to see Bo Nix take a ton of snaps with the first team offense in the actual game itself? Because we know Sean Payton has already said Jarrett Stidham is going to get extended snaps this week as compared to last week. And we know that last week, well, he barely got any. He got 11 snaps. So this practice could end up being pivotal for Bo Nix in terms of what he does in the team periods. What he shows there is going to be very meaningful, I think, in terms of the overall evaluation. I don't know that I think we'll come out of this weekend knowing that he's the starter. I just do. And I think that I think the big bearing on that is going to be the joint practice, not necessarily just the preseason game. So defensively, when the Broncos are out there, what do we want to see? Well, you want to whip up on the Packers offensive line a little bit. The Packers do have a good offensive line on paper. There are some areas of weakness. There are some areas to where I think the Broncos do have a clear edge. The Packers left tackle situation is a little bit unsettled depending on whether or not Rasheed Walker is out there and healthy. I know that there's been cries from the fan base to bring back David Bakhtiari. So we'll see if that happens. Zach Tom has missed time this offseason. He's their starting right tackle, another very good player. But is he going to be out there and is he going to be fully healthy? we'll have to kind of wait and see the injury report for the Packers and what ultimately ends up happening at this joint practice. Josh Myers has been out throughout the offseason due to a personal situation going on. They've been rotating different guys in at center and the guard positions, but right guard seems to be the spot for first round pick Jordan Morgan. And so I think that's a spot where Jordan has kind of struggled early on in his rookie offseason. Maybe John Franklin Myers, Zach Allen, DJ Jones, Malcolm Roach, those guys can give him a little bit of a welcome to the NFL type of moment here in these joint practices. I also am interested to see, how do the Denver Broncos defensive backs hold up against the Green Bay Packers wide receivers? And I think this is the matchup to be watching for when the Broncos are out there defensively, because Green Bay has what I believe to be maybe the deepest wide receiver room in the entire NFL. I know they don't have necessarily the top end guys of, Cincinnati or even maybe Detroit, other places like that. But I do think with Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jalen Reed, they've got Dontavian Wicks, who's a very good potential breakout player, Bo Melton, a speedy threat. They've got tons of other guys, Malik Heath, Grant DuBose, plenty of talent at that wide receiver position, as well as at the tight end position and the playmakers that they've got there. And I think when you see this young Denver Broncos defensive backfield, of course, we expect Pat Surtain to hold his own against any of those guys. How does Riley Moss do? How does Damari Mathis do? Chris Abrams-Drain, who's having a good rookie camp, can he hold his own against players like Wicks and Dobbs and et cetera? So I'm really fascinated to see. I'm sure they'll do some one-on-one stuff, and I'm sure that some Packers receivers are going to win their one-on-one matchups, and there's going to be a lot of dunking happening on Twitter. Let's not overreact too much to that stuff. We care a lot more about what happens in those team drills. As we know, the one-on-ones, Broncos fans just know this. It always favors the wide receiver there. So if the wide receiver wins a one-on-one matchup when it comes to that particular drill in practice, don't be surprised if that happens against one of the potential starting defensive backs there. But I think those are some matchups that we really need to be looking out for, especially when the Packers are on offense. You watch those wide receivers going up against Denver's defensive backfield. And Denver's defensive backfield, speaking of, got a pretty big reinforcement there on the back end of the secondary, as Brandon Jones, the big free agent acquisition at safety, was back in pads at practice. We're going to talk more about some practice notes and takeaways up next on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by FanDuel. Football fans, the football offseason is almost over, and we love sports so much, right? We never want the sports to stop. The football offseason can be the most brutal time of the year, but even with fewer games, the games are ramping up right now, and FanDuel lets us keep the sports going no matter what, whenever we want. All you got to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. If you want to look at Bo Nix Rookie of the Year odds, maybe place a little bet on that. You can go ahead and do that. If you want to see the Broncos still at 5.5 wins projected over under this season, you can check that out as well. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long, and get those last minute MLB daily bets in while you still can. Head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Big money free agent acquisition. Brandon Jones was back in pads for the Denver Broncos at the safety position, giving a substantial boost to the secondary as we get closer and closer to the regular season. We're jumping into the fourth quarter of today's episode, Locked On Broncos today, but Broncos Country, once again, want to say thank you to every single one of you that makes us your first listen of the day, every single day. You know your boys, Cody and Sayre, we're going to be here for you every day, breaking down all the latest news and coverage in Broncos Country every single day leading up to the start of the season. And then, of course, as we get going into the regular season, we appreciate you so much for rocking with us. Let's talk a little bit about some returning players at Denver Broncos practice on Thursday. Brandon Jones, the free agent safety, we've been kind of waiting to see him a lot of this offseason. He was back in pads at practice, a great sign and a great sight to see for the Denver Broncos secondary, as you need Brandon Jones out there, right? We'll talk a little bit about Justin Simmons here in a bit, but obviously with Justin being gone, Brandon Jones has big shoes to fill. I know he's not necessarily going to be able to come in and just replace Justin Simmons right away, but you're expecting him to produce at a high level, and he needs to be out there. He's missed a lot of time with a hamstring injury, missed time during OTAs with another injury. So we really want to see what we've got in Brandon Jones, and great timing for him coming back with this joint practice coming up, maybe get his feet wet there in the preseason. We'll kind of have to wait and see what the Broncos plan on doing in terms of acclimating him, because we didn't hear from Sean Payton on Thursday. So we'll have to kind of wait and see what happens at the joint practice. But also back and offensively, Ben Powers, the starting left guard, he was back after suffering a rib injury. Remember, he kind of got injured on that interception return by Kenny Moore of the Indianapolis Colts. I believe it was a collision between he and running back Samaje Perine that caused that injury. So he was back out there. Nothing to see there in terms of, I think, anything long-term. It was also very scary to see tight end Lucas Kroll getting carted off the field there in the preseason game. Came back that he had a toe injury, and it doesn't sound like it's overly serious. Matter of fact, Lucas Kroll was also back on Thursday after that injury that he suffered in the preseason opener. So all in all, sounds like nothing really to worry about when it comes to the injury front for the Denver Broncos since that Quinn Bailey injury. And certainly you hope that these guys are able to stay healthy when it comes to this joint practice against Green Bay, although intensity always runs high when it comes to joint practices, and you always see guys maybe a little bit over eager. And we know that there's a former Bronco out there, Emmanuel Wilson. He had a really good year last year for the Green Bay Packers. He's a running back, and he's competing for his roster spot, but he was talking to, I believe, Chris Thomason yesterday and talking about how, man, he remembers. So the Broncos cut him, and he went out and had a good year for Green Bay. And he's kind of that example of what Sean Payton has talked about in the past of, you want to arrive at the right 53 players for your roster, and you don't want to let somebody get away that goes on to have success somewhere else. And ultimately you're left wondering, like, well, what did we miss? I mean, we made the right choice getting him in here in the first place, obviously, but we made the wrong choice letting him go. May have just been a numbers game for the Broncos last year, but they did let Emmanuel Wilson go pretty early in the offseason program, and he went and caught on with the Green Bay Packers. Ended up having a good year for them in terms of just playing a reserve role, and looked really good in their preseason opener last week against Cleveland. So very interesting in terms of just the intensity there. You always know a former player coming back to the place that cut him, that's going to be a big ordeal. And speaking of that, it sounds like Justin Simmons will be coming back to Denver eventually in week 11, potentially, as he is reportedly going to be joining the Atlanta Falcons. That deal was reported by Sua Cravens, a former Broncos safety who we know is still close with Justin Simmons, even though they haven't been teammates for a few years. Sua tweeted it out. Justin, we know, had taken a visit to Atlanta as well as New Orleans. So this isn't a report out of left field by any means, but kind of an interesting fit as we just kind of vamp on Justin Simmons and talk now about officially he is for sure a former Denver Bronco. There was, hope from a number in the fan base that maybe he could still be signed back after getting cut, and the Broncos kind of struggling with injuries at safety, cutting Caden Stearns, things like that. Justin is officially not coming back. It sounds like he is joining the Atlanta Falcons, where they also just traded for Matthew Judon off the edge. So kind of addressing a couple of key areas of their defense here in the last couple of days. That's vaulted that team, in my opinion, at least, to kind of a new height in terms of where they're at in my perception. So I love those two pickups for them, two veteran guys that can be real key pieces for a defense that lacked kind of just it's too much missing there. You thought they were for sure going to take an edge early in the draft. They take Michael Penix Jr. So I like that you get Matthew Judon, and then to supplement that by adding Justin Simmons now to Jesse Bates, who's already one of the best safeties in the league. Like, it's a good fit for Justin, and he will potentially be coming back to Denver week 11 of the season when the Atlanta Falcons take on the Denver Broncos on November 17th. So kind of an interesting development there to be watching for. And as of the time that I'm recording this, I haven't seen that confirmed by any of the Schefters or rap sheets of the world just yet. So we'll kind of have to wait and see. Actually, you know what? As I'm recording this, there it is. Justin Simmons signing with the Atlanta Falcons, according to Adam Schefter and all of the other NFL insiders out there. So it is a done deal. and Justin is going to the Falcons. So you never know what's going to happen when you watch the news while recording the show. And it is a 1-year deal, according to James Palmer, worth up to $8 million. So a pretty good payday there for Justin, all things considered. And just very good for him to get to a new team. Wish the Broncos didn't have to play against him this year, but also very excited for him to be joining the Atlanta Falcons. Broncos Country, Cody and I are going to be back to break down joint practice with the Green Bay Packers and all of the goings on from that. It's sure to be intense. It's sure to bring a lot of maybe roster battles. We're going to see a lot of the cream rise to the top when it comes to intra-squad competition like that. You're going up against guys you don't usually go up against. It brings out the best in certain players, and it might bring out some of the worst. We don't know. We're going to react to it, though, on tomorrow's episode of Locked On Broncos, Broncos Country. We'll see you then.